Welcome to Chronicles and Legends. Please hit that subscribe and let us know where in the world are you tuning in from. Let's get started. Not every corpse lies still. Before Hollywood dressed them in velvet, before science dismissed them as myth, there were stories, buried stories, feared stories. What you're about to hear was buried with the dead and whispered by the living. These aren't just tales, they are warnings left behind in grave soil and blood. Real vampire cases history tried to bury. You won't sleep after this. Chapter 1. The grave stirs at midnight. This is not the tale of a romantic predator. This is the truth that haunted the villages of Eastern Europe, of bodies that refused to rot, of coffins that creaked open at night, of creatures that fed on their own kin. In the old world, death was not final. It was a door, and sometimes that door opened the wrong way. They had many names: Upir, Strigoi, Nosferatu, Vrikolakas. Each name carried a different echo, a different fear, but the meaning was always the same. The dead walk, and they are thirsty. Villagers in 16th century Serbia told of shadows returning to doorstep thresholds, eyes glowing in the dark like dying embers, crops failing, livestock found mutilated, infants pale in their cradles. The cause, not a sickness, not a curse, but something in the graveyard, something they buried with shaking hands now crawling, back up through the soil. These weren't the pale, polished nobles you've seen in films. No black cloaks, no slicked back hair. The real vampires were bloated, their bellies stretched as if glutted on blood, skin turned reddish or purple, lips stained, eyes open, glassy and wide, nails grown long like talons, and from their mouths, blood. Fresh, sometimes still warm. Villagers knew what it meant. The grave was not closed, the body was not finished, and the soul was still inside. Not all who died would rise, but those who did often came from cursed deaths, suicides, the excommunicated, murderers, those born on certain days, those never baptized, even children if they were born with a veil over their face, what they called a caul. The signs were never missed. A body that didn't decompose, a sibling dying days later for no reason, a villager dreaming of the dead and then found lifeless by morning. The solution? Brutal, but necessary. Dig them up. Drive a stake through the chest, not to kill, but to pin the creature to the earth, keep it from crawling free again. And if that didn't work, cut off the head, burn the body, scatter the ashes at the crossroads, or, in the most desperate cases, feed those ashes to the victim's family. A cure as horrifying as the curse itself. Garlic, iron, holy symbols, sacred herbs. These weren't movie props. They were rituals of survival. Doors were smeared with lamb's blood. Babies wore amulets of red thread and wolf's tooth. And if a loved one died, the villagers watched. They waited. For if the body twitched, if the mouth opened, if blood welled from the nose, they knew what had to be done. You see, for them, this wasn't myth. It was memory. It was pattern. It was fear, ancient and inherited, passed down like a warning. Tales told not for entertainment, but for protection. You think you're safe because you know better, because science explains things now. But the people back then, they saw things we forget or refuse to believe. Things that come when the moon is high and the wind smells like the grave. They knew that sometimes the dead came back, and not for peace, not for closure. They came back hungry. This is not fantasy. This is not fiction. These are the stories written in grave soil and blood, in the margins of church records and whispered through clenched teeth by firelight. So the next time you feel a chill at your window, or hear a knock with no one behind it, remember, Not every grave stays closed, and not every corpse lies still. The vampire of folklore is not what Hollywood promised. It is what your ancestors feared. It is rot, it is rage, it is return, and it waits, in the dark, for you to forget. Chapter 2. Bloodlines and Curses. They always came back to the blood, not just to drink it, but to follow it, track it, infect it. In the old ways, vampires didn't choose their victims at random. They came for those they knew in life, a brother, a mother, a child. Because blood remembers. And the curse, it spreads like rot in the roots of a family tree. There were rules, dark, cruel rules passed down in whispers, in graveyards and over candlelit prayers. You didn't mourn the dead too loudly, they might hear you. You didn't speak their names after dark. It gave them power. And you never, ever touched the body with bare skin, because that's how it started. The first signs were small, a feeling that you're being watched in your sleep, that the air grows colder in the place they used to sit, that the dog won't stop growling at the window. Then came the dreams, always the same, the dead returning, smiling, crying, begging. And when you woke, you'd feel drained, weak, your lips pale, your breath shallow, sometimes with bruises on your arms, sometimes with marks on your throat, and no one would believe you until the next person fell, ill. The villagers knew what it meant. A bloodline had been marked. This wasn't just about monsters feeding. This was a sickness of the soul, a parasite of death that passed through flesh, name, and memory. In Romania, it was believed a strigoi could be created by drinking blood, yes, but also by sin, curse, or even something as small as a wrong birth. Born on a Saturday, cursed, the seventh child of the same gender, cursed, stillborn and improperly buried, cursed. And once a vampire came into a family line, it could stretch across generations, unseen, quiet, growing stronger in the silence. They said some families were born under dark stars, doomed to always be hunted by their own dead. So how did they stop it? With rituals, terrifying, ancient, often cruel. If someone was suspected of being a vampire, they didn't get a peaceful burial. The villagers would drive a wooden stake through the corpse, often made of ash, hawthorn, or blackthorn. If that failed, the next steps were brutal, decapitation, burning the body, mixing the ashes into water and forcing the living relatives to drink it. A form of spiritual inoculation. Drink the curse and survive it, or don't and die screaming. In Greece, the vrikolikas were feared above all. They could knock on doors at night, but only once. If you answered, you'd die within days. So people were taught, never answer a knock unless you hear it twice. In Russia, the upia were known to live among the living for days, even weeks before feeding, working, laughing, loving, until one night someone would go missing, and the next morning the neighbor was gone too. But the most terrifying truth? Sometimes a person didn't need to die to become one. Some vampires were born, children with tails, infants born with teeth, people who couldn't reflect in mirrors. They were watched from birth, some even killed quietly before they could grow up. And some were simply chosen. A family cursed by a dying witch, a soldier who killed too many in war, a woman who bled during church rites. The transformation was slow. Days, weeks, months. First, they'd stop eating. Then they'd stop sleeping. Then came the night walks, the voices, the smells. Until finally, the thirst. Once you drank blood, even once, there was no return. You see, in folklore, vampires weren't made by other vampires. They were made by death, sin, and sorrow. By wrong burial, wrong birth, wrong belief. This is why villages took such care. Graves were salted, bodies wrapped in nets, so the corpse would be too distracted to rise. Some were buried face down, so if they awoke, they'd dig toward hell, not the surface. Everything was done with one goal: keep the dead dead. But sometimes, none of it worked. Sometimes, a child would vanish, a well would go dry, a coffin would be found open. Sometimes, even after the stake, the body would smile. And then they knew. They weren't just facing a cursed corpse. They were facing a revenant, a true vampire, one who had made a pact or been born under a blood moon, one that couldn't be stopped by wood or fire. For that, you needed something darker. The priests would not help. The church denied the existence of vampires for centuries, so the villagers turned to older gods, to pagan rites, to blood magic and the iron laws of the earth. And even then, there were no guarantees. Some say you can still trace the old vampire families, that their bloodlines remain, scattered, hidden, cursed, that in some villages they still salt the graves, still check for breath with a mirror, still hammer nails into the hearts of the dead, just in case. Because the curse of the vampire is not just in the bite, it's in the blood. And blood, my friend, never forgets. Chapter 3. The Vampire Trials. They came with torches, not to chase a beast, but to face what they had buried with their own hands. Because by the 18th century, the vampire was no longer a whispered rumor. It had become a public crisis. And, across Eastern Europe, villagers, soldiers, even empires, all were preparing for war, not against a living enemy, but against the dead. It began in Serbia, 1725. A man named Petar Blagojević had been buried for 10 days. Then suddenly, 9 people died within a week. Each on their deathbed claimed the same thing. Petar came to me. At night, he stood over me, and I couldn't move. The villagers begged for his body to be exhumed. What they found chilled. Their bones. The body was untouched by decay. The mouth, red with fresh blood. His eyes, open. And when they drove the stake into his chest, he screamed. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. A sound from a corpse split the air, and the villagers ran. That wasn't the end. Just 1 year later, Arnold Paole, another Serbian man, claimed before his death that he had been attacked by a vampire in Greece. He smeared himself with vampire blood and ate dirt from the grave, an ancient cure. But after a fatal fall from a horse, he was buried. Weeks later, people began dying again. The villagers exhumed Arnold's corpse. Same story. No decay, fresh blood, red lips. But this time, they didn't just stop at one body. 17 more were dug up, some barely cold in the ground, and all showed signs of the same unnatural preservation. They staked and burned them all. These were not rumors. These were documented investigations by imperial authorities. Austrian medical officials were dispatched to Serbia. They observed the bodies, they interviewed witnesses, they watched the exhumations and wrote detailed reports. They were trained in science, but what they saw defied it. And when they returned home, they didn't deny the vampire, they warned of it. Across Europe, the panic spread like wildfire. The Habsburg Empire, one of the most powerful in Europe, was suddenly forced to take a stance on a supernatural plague. Why? Because villages were desecrating graveyards. Priests were being bribed to perform illegal exorcisms, and corpses, hundreds of them, were being exhumed, mutilated, and destroyed. These weren't fringe cults. These were entire communities, afraid, desperate, and convinced that the dead were hunting them. But what made these corpses seem so undead? Modern science offers theories. Bodies buried in shallow, cold graves may resist decay. Gas buildup can cause bloating, even movement. Fluid, can leak from the mouth and nose, giving the appearance of fresh blood. The skin recedes, making hair and nails appear to grow. All reasonable, all explainable, but to a grieving mother, to a priest staring into a corpse that looks more alive than dead, science means nothing, because they saw it, they heard it, and they believed. Across regions like Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia, folklore and hysteria collided. Precaution became obsession. Graves were salted. Corpses were buried face down to prevent digging out. Sickles were placed over necks, so if the corpse sat up, it would be decapitated. Coins placed under tongues. Garlic sewn into shrouds. Nails driven into skulls. Some bodies were chained, others dismembered. Some burned so thoroughly that their ashes were scattered at the crossroads, where spirits were believed to lose their way. This wasn't just ritual, this was warfare against death itself. And in the midst of it all came a question. What if it was true? What if death wasn't final? What if grief could become contagious? Because that's what the vampire really was, not just a monster, but a symbol of plague, of trauma, of things that linger and rot and refuse to stay buried. Eventually, the Enlightenment arrived. Science, medicine, reason. The vampire was dismissed, officially. But the damage was done. The graves had been opened, the stories had been carved into bone and earth, and the fear had taken root. A fear not just of death, but of what comes after. Later, when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, in 1897 he wasn't inventing something new. He was giving voice to centuries of whispers, to the exhumations, to the hysteria, to the very real terror that once swept through villages like wildfire. He dressed the vampire in a cape, but the grave-drenched beast still lived underneath. Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover vampire burials, bodies pinned with stakes, skulls removed, stones jammed in mouths, in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Italy. Proof that long after the panic ended, the fear remained. So now, ask yourself, why do we still fear the knock at the window? Why do we hesitate to walk through a graveyard alone? Why do tales of the undead still chill us, no matter how rational we become? Because the vampire isn't just a myth, it's a memory, a stain, a scar on the human soul. It is what happens when death becomes uncertain, when love turns to hunger, when grief refuses to let go. So sleep well tonight. But if you hear a knock, just once, not twice, don't open the door, because you remember now, and it remembers you.